Welcome to our Appalachia. My name is Phil Conn. I'm your host for this series, and as you know, we talk about some of the heritage and the culture of our Eastern Kentucky region. Today, we're going to talk about a topic that many of you may be familiar with, life in the one-room schools of Eastern Kentucky. And we have a lady who knows a lot about that. Her name is Mrs. S.D. Foster. She's from Ashland, Kentucky, but she didn't start off there. As a matter of fact, she started off in Elliott County, slightly to our southeast, and she has lived in Moorhead, Kentucky during times in the past.
3 years.
3 years, and she's going to tell us about life in the one-room schools. She not only experienced one-room schools as a student, but also as a teacher. Ms. Foster, it's really a pleasure to have you on campus.
Thank you.
And I should point out that Ms. Foster is an alumna of Morehead State, went to the normal school here years ago, and we will have an opportunity to ask her about that. You told me I could ask you your age, Ms. Foster, and I'd say that you are awfully proud of the things you've experienced and the years you've lived in northeastern Kentucky.
Sure I am.
How old are you?
Pearl Harbor Day, the 7th of December, I was 88.
88 years old. Well, that means that you were born before the turn of the century in
93.
18 and 93.
Right.
So at the time you went to one-room schools, that's all there was, pretty much, is one-room school
Right.
situation. When did you start schools?
I started school when I was 5 years old,
5 years old.
and I could read.
You could read when you started. Well, that's a pretty good
You wanna
start.
know would you want to know how I learned to read?
I certainly would like to know how you learned to read.
Well, we lived in a big log house
This is in what part of Elliott County?
in Elliott County. It was called Beartown.
Beartown, right.
The post office was Lettingham, Kentucky. My father was postmaster.
Mm-hmm.
And this big log house was made out of big white pine logs. And of course, people them days, they didn't have much money to buy wallpaper. And the walls were papered with newspapers.
Right. I've seen a lot of newspaper wallpaper.
Well, I'd crawl around the floor when I was just between 1 and 5, of course. And my mother taught me the words and the letters.
Oh,
And
wait.
at 5, when I started school, I could read.
That's an interesting way to learn to read. The irony is a lot of folks wouldn't relate learning to read with wallpaper made out
Right.
of newspaper. So
Right.
it certainly served a purpose for you. So at the time you went to a one-room school, the customary age for individuals to start school, I guess, was 6, but you could start a little early if you wished to.
Yeah, if you wanted to.
It's fairly informal about deciding
Very
to go.
informal, no laws.
How many students were in your school at a given point in time?
Oh, in that school, well, I'd say there'd be 40.
40 kids, all the way from first grade through 8th grade.
Eighth.
And the ages started at 5, and what were some of the older ages?
Well, I'd go up to 14 and 15.
Right. So most of the kids would stick with it for 8 years, or did a lot of them drop out?
Not
along
all
the
of
way?
them. Most of them didn't.
I see. How did the calendar run? Was it a 9-month situation pretty
Started
much like
in July,
that? Middle of the summer then?
middle of the summer, started in July and ended around Christmas.
Okay, so it was pretty much a 6-month school.
Always 6 months.
Mm-hmm.
Then a little later than that, they got 7 months.
Mm-hmm. Did you take a break in late summer or fall for harvesting, or did some kids just drop out for that?
The kids just they just keep their kids home to work.
If they had to work the farm.
Yeah.
But at least the kids were available to help with spring planting and the early part of the growing season.
Yeah.
Right. What period of the day was taken up with school? Was it pretty much a 5-day school week?
4 to 8. 8 to 4.
8 o'clock to 4 o'clock. So that was pretty much a school day like we have today.
Yeah.
How many schools would you say were in Elliott County at the turn of the century? Maybe 20, 30?
Yeah, there's more than that.
More than that?
Oh, according to my institute picture, there'd be about 50.
I'll be 50 schools throughout Elliott County.
Yeah.
So while they were one-room schools, in a county like Elliott at the turn of the century, every child did have an opportunity to go to school somewhere.
Right.
And some of the kids, I guess, walked for
They
3
all
4
walked.
miles. They all walked.
Everybody walked.
No such thing as a school bus, and if there were, there wouldn't have been any roads to use, I guess.
Right.
Right. So you did walk to school, but it'd range anywhere from, what, a mile to 5 miles? No one had to walk much further than that, I guess, the nearest
They didn't have to go
school.
5.
Okay. So the schools were relatively accessible.
I was fortunate when I was a child. We lived close to the school.
Did you have a superintendent of schools in Elliott County at that
Yeah.
time?
The superintendent at that time was when I first went to school. I don't remember the superintendent. I just remember my first teacher.
Right.
His name was Dr. Wales Brown. He was a medical doctor
I'll be.
and a teacher too.
So he kept a medical practice going of what you'd call a family doctor.
Yeah.
And also
That's right.
taught.
Right.
Well, that's an interesting combination.
Yeah. Yes, it is.
But now the superintendent, was it a man or a woman when you first remember in Elliott County?
Well, the first superintendent that I remember was Molly Horton Green, and she was a relative. She was first cousin to my mother, a lady.
But now, was she heavily involved with all the one-room schools?
Oh,
Did
yes.
She traveled
She
around?
was a superintendent.
How did she travel at that point in time?
Horseback.
Horseback from school to school. And that was pretty much the transportation other than walking
Right.
in the early part of the century.
That was when I was going to school, but when I was, the year I taught there, the superintendent was Dave Gray of
Now-
Sandy Hook, Kentucky.
The preparation, though, for a school teacher was pretty much the basic 8 grades.
Right.
And at that point in
But you
time,
had to go away and get something else besides that.
if you wanted to be a school teacher.
Right.
But now they did have some emergency teachers with only an 8th grade education.
Well, they
I guess.
perhaps did, but I couldn't name any of them.
What was your first teaching assignment?
My first,
That was in Elliott County.
that was in Elliott County. It was called Ibex School.
But now at that time, you had finished 8 grades, but you had not been away to normal
Yes,
school.
I had.
Yes, you
I'd
had
been away to teachers' training,
Where was that?
Olive Hill.
I see.
Professor D.M. Holbrook
I see.
had a subscription school there.
Mm-hmm.
And my folks was determined that I'd be a teacher,
Right.
and they sent me there.
So it was really kind of a private operation that this gentleman set up to train teachers.
Right,
So you
I
taught for 1 year in Elliott,
1912.
and then you decided to come to Moorhead.
Well,
or
my
your-
folks moved to Moorhead in
your
the
family
meantime.
did. But you took advantage of the opportunity to study at the normal school here.
Moorhead Normal School.
Tell us a little bit about Moorhead Normal School.
Oh, we had the best time ever was.
What year was that?
That was the year of 1913.
1913. That was before World War I had ever dawned on anyone.
That was the first year I was here.
Right.
But it was going on before that.
And almost everyone here in the normal school was preparing to be a school teacher.
Yeah.
How many students were there at that
Oh,
time?
that big room was full. I'd say there's 40 anyway.
Was it pretty much on the current site of Morehead State University, nearby?
Well, you know where the courthouse is?
Certainly do.
Street that went straight up beside the courthouse,
Right.
right up into the campus, and that's where the building was, we went to school.
So it's right in this general vicinity.
Yeah.
But from that time, your family moved permanently from Elliott County to Rowan County.
Right.
So you were a Rowan County then for many years.
Yeah.
How many years of study was a normal school program ordinarily?
Well, we went from Christmas until about June.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, after Christmas we'd start.
Okay, so actually the way it was set up, it was pretty much just the opposite of a one-room school teaching arrangement, so people could teach
Right.
part of the year and go to normal school.
Go to normal school because we started our country one-room schools the first of July,
I see.
and they lasted 6 months.
So it fit in very conveniently.
Then we
to-
come back to Moorhead and go back to school again.
I see. After you finished normal school, then what were your teaching assignments here in Rowan County?
After, my first school was called Holly District.
Mm-hmm.
As I told you, it's in this section across. You go toward Soldier and you get down toward Soldier, you turn right. I could find the road now if I go over the old road.
Right. At that time, though, what year was that now? Was that 1913?
That was 1913.
1913. So at that time, the roads weren't anything to brag about, I'm sure. And
Rough.
how did you travel to the school where you taught? Did you live in that community?
I had to stay in a home in a district.
I see. So a lot of the teachers,
I boarded with a certain family.
a lot of the
That's what
teachers
they
then
called it.
boarded with the family
boarded with
in
the
the
family.
school area.
paid them so much.
And at that time, you were a single woman.
Right.
And I guess a lot of school teachers were young women. A lot of men, though, as well, you tell me.
Oh, yes.
At that time, were there more men than women, or pretty much a balance?
I don't know if there were more or not. It was probably about equal. All that joined my district, the Holly district, were women.
But at that time, there were probably more men in elementary education than there are today.
Probably was.
And at the time you taught, you literally had to get into a community, even if boarding. It wasn't possible to travel across the county because of the transportation, of course.
No way to get there.
Right. Well, now tell me about the life of a one-room school teacher. I know is a whole lot more than having all of your fancy teaching aids and all of your hot lunch programs and whatever, but tell me what the typical day of a teacher in a one-room school was all about.
You've been in this school building down here on the campus, haven't you?
I certainly have.
Well, you'd walk in that, it wouldn't be near as nice as that is.
That was one of the nicer one-room schools.
That would be nice.
Okay, you're talking about a school that was brought to campus off of Brushy Creek somewhere.
Right.
Okay.
And you go in, and there's nothing but just an empty school building with a few seats for the children, enough for the children, and a pot-bellied stove in the middle of the room.
It's a coal-burning stove.
Wood.
A wood burner in this county.
Yeah.
Okay.
And in Elliott County it was, too.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. And I always had to board about a mile away from the school.
Mm-hmm.
Get up in snow, come up to here on me.
Right.
And go to school, maybe have to build my own fires.
Right. So you were walking right along with the kids.
That's
right. Right. And you'd have to come in and build a fire in the morning. And I guess in these counties where there wasn't a lot of coal production, you actually used wood. Because it'd been hard to have brought coal in here from the coal fields anyway.
It was a wood stove.
I see. Now, was the wood brought to you, though, by somebody hired by the county?
Some of the men that lived in the district would get the wood.
Just on a volunteer basis?
On a volunteer basis.
So at that point, families were heavily involved in the school. They really wanted to make it go, and they supported you any way they could.
Well, I was always supported.
Right.
I think most of them were.
Right. What'd you do for water supply? Did you have a well, or did people...
Had a well.
Okay. But I've heard of some schools where people literally had to bring water with them every day.
Well, we had a well, and you carry water in the bucket and have a dipper, and everybody drank out of the same dipper.
I see, right. That'd keep you together, wouldn't it?
I had a little folding cup that I carried in my pocket.
Right, right. With 40 kids, it'd be hard to find a place on the dipper that hadn't been used, I'd dare say.
Yeah.
Right. What
they
about...
live just as long as we do.
Right. What about lunchtime? I guess everybody
brought their lunch.
Right, and you just had a break then, and everyone ate whatever they brought.
Go outside and go anywhere they wanted to, and some would, 2 or 3 would get together, and some would go off to themselves, and so on.
But now, how did you divide the job of teaching? Number 1, among 8 grades, and number 2, among different subjects. How in the world can you keep that going? That's worse than the 3-ring circus.
That's what everybody wonders about.
Right.
Of course, now in Elliott County, we didn't know too much about the grades. We had first reader, second reader, third reader, fourth reader, fifth, and so on.
So it wasn't graded as much as it was set
Not in Elliott County.
along readers.
Not when I started.
I see.
But when I got over to Round, that we were in grades.
So now in Elliott County, did you just go to school until you felt you had all of the information that was available to you down?
We went just as long as we could.
Did you have any kind of a graduation note at the end of it?
No. They didn't know what graduation was.
You just went to get some book learning, and that was pretty much it.
Well, when I was 18, wasn't quite 18, my folks decided I needed to go away to school. Now, they sent me over to Olive to a subscription school.
Right.
Professor D.M. Holbrook had a subscription school. And that's where I got my teacher's training.
Right.
He's a wonderful teacher.
But now in Elliott County, they did have a concept of grades, but of course it was 8 grades within a single building.
Right.
How in the world did you keep the grades straight in your own mind, or did you worry about it that much?
Well, we just didn't worry about it too much.
Right.
We had, like I said, the first, second, third, and fourth readers.
Right.
Well, we could tell who was in the first reader. It'd be the little 6-year-olds, you know. And we had a big, long recitation bench. Well, you start, and you have all your preliminaries of the morning and start your school. Say, first reader. They come up on the recitation seat.
Right.
Well, when you're through with them, then you call the second reader.
Right.
Now, this was Elliott County, the first one. They had a little more formal than the others.
To what extent were the children allowed to decide where their level was, though, and to what extent was the teacher there to tell them when they were able to move on to another reader? The teacher pretty much guide them from one reader to the next?
Yes. The teacher knew whether they were able to go on to the next reader or
right.
not.
You know, it amazes me, a lot of folks who attended one-room schools have told me that there's a great deal of help, though, among students, that the older kids would help out the small kids and in some cases help the teacher.
I guess that was so because when I went to school,
right.
I was in that grade school too. My brother was 2 years younger than me. I can see him now standing up to the blackboard and looking back to me. We diagram. You know what diagramming
sure,
is, don't
diagramming
you?
sentences,
yeah.
you mean?
But he couldn't diagram, that's one thing.
Right.
But he was good in history.
Right.
And I was good in diagramming.
I'll do.
So he helped me out in history, and I'd help him out in his diagramming.
A lot of people have described to me, too, a situation where if you were a real precocious kid, a real sharp kid, you could kind of listen to the next group and almost get a head start by the time you got to that reader. But it does seem to me a real task for a teacher to not only cover that many grades, but that many topics.
I can't remember anybody in my school when I was a child going to school that was any better than I was. That was the trouble. I didn't get any help.
Right. Well, we talk about reading, writing, and arithmetic, and a lot of folks say that those are the basics we should still stress. Is that pretty much what you did during a school day, reading and writing and arithmetic?
Sure.
You mentioned, though, history, so there was some notion of social studies.
We had history and grammar, we call that diagram. Grammar.
Right.
That's what they call it, English now.
But at that point, they'd diagram sentences, they'd conjugate verbs, they'd work with the tenses of verbs.
Yeah.
I got some of that type of schooling, although I never got to attend a one-room school.
Oh, you didn't?
No, I didn't.
You missed something.
Right, I understand that. I have a lot of friends who did those. As a matter of fact, I went to Berea College in the early 60s, and most of the kids came from the Southern Mountain region, and they did a survey, and over half of the kids I went to college with had attended a one-room school at one point in time. So until the 60s, there were many, many one-room schools.
Yes, I know.
I was telling you earlier that I saw a survey that showed that in 1965, there were still over 1,000 one-room schools in eastern Kentucky. And I recall there were about 55 in Harlan County. As a matter of fact, I worked in that county.
Yeah.
So while one-room schools are a thing of the past in this state, they certainly aren't in the distant past.
Well, they were...
certainly served a purpose of having education where it was needed. Well, tell me what you consider to be some of the advantages of a one-room school in terms of the spirit of community or the spirit of people working together to improve their educational needs.
Well, I don't know whether there's any advantages to it or not.
Right.
They just knew they had to do it, see.
Right.
There was no place else to go.
Right.
Everybody come to the one-room school.
So it was really at that point a matter of going to school the only way you could go to school.
Yes.
One that was
I've had them all the way from 3 years to 29.
Right.
That's in Round County, though.
Right. Now, of course, you wrapped up your teaching career rather early in your life to be a homemaker, to have a family. So you taught a total of 5 years, and all of your teaching experience was in a one-room school then.
Right.
Of course, a lot of folks in the 60s were very resistant to closing one-room schools because they felt it was a real center for community activities. When you were a teacher, were there activities other than just regular schooling that went on in the schoolhouse?
In school, the only thing we'd have would be a pie supper or box supper or something like that.
Was that primarily for raising money for the school?
That was raising money so we could maybe get a chair to sit in.
Right. So it was a fundraising activity for the school when you had something else there. A lot of folks talk with great nostalgia about recess, about the playground at one-room schools. Now, if you look at a one-room school playground with a dirt court for basketball and for a rusty old set of swings, you wonder where the mystique is in the recess. But tell us about recess. Did kids look forward to it, and what kind of games did they play?
Well, sometimes they played horseshoes. I pitched horseshoes with my kids, and I've also played ball with them.
Right.
You know, what they call round town ball.
Right.
And That's about all the games that they play. Some would play peg.
Right.
The boys would with their knives.
But were they allowed to get out of the school ground, or did you watch them pretty close?
Oh, they had to stay within the school ground.
Right. At that point in time, I don't guess you even had a situation, what you'd call a truancy officer. There was no law forcing people to go to school at all.
The trustee was the main man, the trustee of the district. They had trustees, what they call trustees.
Right.
And you could appeal to the trustees if necessary.
If you thought that a child wasn't attending school as much as he should.
But I never had that problem.
You couldn't force them by law at all at that point in time.
No.
What about relationship with the parents? Did you ever go to parents' homes to talk about a student, or did they ordinarily come to you?
Never, neither one.
They pretty much left the schooling up to you.
They left it up to me.
And you, of course, just assumed that they were taking care of things.
The only time I ever went to the home, and they'd invite me to come and eat a chicken dinner or something.
Well, that's a good reason to go. If you were boarding in someone else's home out there, you appreciated any gesture of neighborliness, I'm sure.
Oh, yes, but I always had a nice place to stay.
What about discipline in the school? How was it handled, and how important was that so far as you were concerned?
Well, I never had much trouble with it. I whipped one boy, which I was always sorry of. But I was under pressure to do that from one of the trustees.
Was that with a switch or a paddle?
Just switch.
Right.
So I didn't hit him very hard.
Right.
But I was always ashamed of it.
Right.
He was a 17-year-old boy, almost big as you are.
But at that point in time, now, a 17-year-old boy, if you told him it was time to take a whipping, they had generally subject themselves to it.
I've thought since. He could have reached up and took that switch, and I was 18 years old, weighed 98 pounds.
He wouldn't have had much trouble handling you.
That's right.
But there was tremendous...
He just hopped over in his seat and took it.
Right.
But that's the only whipping I ever did in school, and I was always sorry.
And you say you were only 1 or 2 years older than him.
I'll say he was 17.
Right. At that point in time, though, there seemed to be tremendous respect for elders and for people in a position like a school teacher. And
well, yes, I think they respected us.
Did some of your fellow school teachers have discipline troubles? Did they have to ride herd a little harder than that?
Not that I know of.
So you felt that people that came to school, they didn't have to come. They came there to learn, and ordinarily kids were well behaved.
Oh, you had to send one home once in a while. I've had one boy. He wasn't mean, but he would not study, and he didn't want anybody else to. He was all fun.
He was there mainly because his parents expected him to come.
And he's continually aggravating all the other kids. He wouldn't let them study, and he didn't want to study.
Right.
So, after so long a time, I said to him, I said, Elmer, you don't want to study, and you bother everybody else. Why don't you just go home?
Right. Wasn't any formal suspension operation then. You just told the guy he ought to move on.
He went home.
Right.
And that was the last of it, till about so many years later, after I was married. I went up in the country to visit some relatives. A young man come up and spoke to me, said, you remember me? Know me? And I didn't, of course. I said, well, you look familiar, but I don't believe I can place you. He said, I'm that mean boy that you used to have in school and sent home.
Right. Stuck with him.
Said, you ought to beat me to death.
At that point in time, he understood where you were coming from. Well, now, what about an individual in Elliott County or Round County in, say, 1910, 1915, who wanted to learn to read and write, of course, but didn't want to be a school teacher? Was the 8th grade or the one-room school experience pretty much it?
The 8th grade was about as far as they'd go.
Okay.
If they didn't intend to teach, that was it.
But was there in Round County or Elliott County in, say, 1915, was there a high school program for people who didn't want to teach? That hadn't been developed at that time at all. So I guess anyone who wanted to...
Well, in Round County, was this normal school up here.
Right, but that was primarily for teachers.
Yes.
So after you
wanted to be a teacher.
Right. After you got the basics, it was assumed that you either went ahead in your training to be a teacher,
right,
or you went to work and made your success the best way you could.
That's right.
Were there any young people, though, who went away to a school, to board a school, say, like Berea College or some of the older 4-year schools?
I had a couple of young men that made teachers that came out of school in the Holly district over and around. That's in Round County.
But there were some kind of foundation schools, or what you might call boarding high schools, in certain parts of the state if a person wanted to travel off to attend them.
But not many of them got away from home that far.
Certainly wasn't the normal thing to do.
No, it wasn't.
It was a matter of getting your schooling and going to work.
That's right.
Would you say that more girls were finishing the 8th grade in 1910 than boys were because of the opportunity for work?
1910, that's when I was still in grade school.
Who was finishing up mainly, the boys or the girls, or about an even mix?
About even.
Really? So both boys and girls felt that it was important to learn to read and write.
Yes.
And I guess it varied a whole lot depending on...
Really, most of them would rather come to school or stay home.
If they stayed home, they had to work pretty hard back then.
Right.
Wasn't a matter of laying around watching TV, was it?
No.
Right.
They had to work on the farms.
Right. Most of the communities where you taught, were they rather isolated? I mean, were there very few people coming into the area other than persons who lived there?
Well, in Round County, my first school over in the Holly district, it was, there was 80 children registered in the district. But not that many came.
Right.
Some of them were grown up, 16, 17, 18, they didn't come.
Right.
And, but I'd have 40 and 50 at school. That's where I had the 29-year-old man come to school.
I'll be. It's a big job, and people that wanted to read and write would come at 29 back then. Right.
That one man did.
That's certainly admirable.
Of course, that's where I taught the moonlight school.
Right.
But he came to the day school.
Right.
Come up on the recitation seat with the first graders.
I'll be. Well, I admire his spunk.
I did too.
Right. Well, Ms. Foster, I'm going to have to thank you and say goodbye to you. We've been delighted to have you visit us, and you've given us tremendous insight into the life in the one-room schools of Eastern Kentucky, and we want you to be back with us again to talk about some of your other experiences.
Okay.
Thank you very much, and to our audience, we are glad you joined us for this part of our Appalachia. Join us again when we discuss another interesting aspect of our heritage and our culture.